Yes, I was surprised to hear from Daniel that that Dawson's less well known in England than here. But that will soon be remedied, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I want to add one thing to my resume, and that is that I was a member of the dissertation committee for Dr. Falkenberg. During his post-conversion years, Eliot thought long and hard about questions of culture, and his primary interlocutor on the topic was the historian Christopher Dawson. The influence of Dawson on Eliot has long been known. Indeed, Eliot acknowledged it repeatedly himself. In her biography of Dawson, Christina Scott highlights a time when Eliot was lecturing in the United States and was asked what writer was the most powerful intellectual influence in England. He answered, Christopher Dawson. Russell Kirk, in his book on Eliot, declared, of social thinkers in his own time, none influenced Eliot more than Dawson. Yet, Kirk did not elaborate, and later critics mostly ignored the connection. Here I wish to focus on just one idea on which Eliot and Dawson were united, the belief that culture was important in ways and in some ways prior to politics. This is a common idea in our circles today. And that education was the way that culture was passed on. I will just begin to show how Kirk and Scruton developed these ideas further in their own time. As the shadows of communism and fascism fell over Europe in the 1930s, Dawson wrote a book entitled Beyond Politics, published in 1939. As the title implies, Dawson suggests that the immense problems Europe was facing could not be solved by politics alone. He essentially argues that cultural order is primary and political order secondary. In the same year, Eliot published The Idea of a Christian Society, and in the preface he names Dawson's book as one of the major influences on his own. Throughout the next decade, Eliot continued to work out his cultural ideas, which were developed, as were Dawson's, in relation to anthropological principles. The culmination of his thinking was expressed in Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, 1948, and again in the preface to that book he acknowledges a particular debt to Dawson. Given their emphasis on the priority of culture, what solutions do these two propose? Well, not very good ones. That is, they don't have a neat 10-point plan that could be easily implemented. Their proposals are explicitly not political, but they put forward ideas that are beyond politics. Here's what Dawson suggests early in the book. If Western civilization is to be saved, it is necessary to find some way of removing the divided aims, the lack of social discipline, and the absence of national unity that are the weaknesses of democracy, without falling under the tyrannous of dictatorship and the fanatical intolerance of a totalitarian party. And we cannot do this by politics alone. No constitutional change will touch the roots of our weakness, for it is the life of society, and not merely the government of society, that needs reordering. This is a clear statement of his thesis in the entire work. The problems are societal ones, primarily, and the solutions must primarily address the life of society and only secondarily the government of society. Eliot sums up this stance succinctly. What we are seeking, he says, is not a program for a party, but a way of life for a people. This foreshadows the thinking of Scruton and Kirk, who spent much time in their political writings on the humanities. As Scruton put it, cultural conservatism in all its forms has been an attempt to lift conservatism from the battleground of politics into the peaceful arena of literature and academic life. One extra political domain these thinkers emphasized was that of education, since it is the means of transmitting the cultural heritage of the past. Eliot declared, A nation's system of education is much more important than its system of government. Only a proper system of education can unify the active and contemplative life, action and speculation, politics, and the arts. Hence, he states that those who sympathize with Mr. Dawson in resenting the tyranny of politics must direct their attention to the problem of education. He devotes the last chapter of Notes to educational ideas because of the close association, he says, in many minds between education and culture. Dawson wrote about education throughout his career, and he summed up his thoughts in one of his last books, The Crisis of Western Education, 1961, written when he was teaching at Harvard. At the beginning of the book, he asserts that it is clear that culture is inseparable from education, since education in the widest sense of the word is what the anthropologists term enculturation. That is, the process by which culture is handed on by the society and acquired by the individual. The entire book is premised on this insight, that education is essential to the transmission of culture. Scruton comes to the same conclusion, and I haven't heard of any reference by Scruton to Dawson. I asked Dan about it, and he didn't find anything. I'd be interested to know if anybody comes across that. But I think Scruton basically worked these ideas out for himself. The values implicit in the pursuit of education, he says, or in the participation in any such autonomous arrangement, cannot necessarily be reduced to a code of conduct, a system of rules, or an ideal of the good for man. They consist rather in an intimation of a human world and of access to that world through understanding. Hence, the idea of education coexists with that of culture. There are two closely related problems with education, according to Dawson and Eliot and Kirk and Scruton, in our modern era. Education has become largely a state monopoly, and the turn towards practicality and specialization in education has pushed aside the liberal arts. Eliot points out that the demand for universal education has led to lower standards and to a takeover by the state. He bemoans the displacement of the family in education, saying, "Instead of congratulating ourselves on our progress whenever the school assumes another responsibility hitherto left to parents, we might do better to admit that we have arrived at a stage of civilization at which the family is irresponsible or incompetent or helpless, at which parents cannot be expected to train their children properly, at which many parents cannot afford to feed them properly and would not know how, even if they had the means, and that education must step in and make the best of a bad job." Of course, we see this tendency being pushed to the limits today. Kirk spends much time deploring the move toward increasing the number of university students after World War II. By 1953, he writes, "It was clear that many university administrators were bent upon increasing enrollments enormously, at whatever cost to academic achievement standards." And Scruton says simply, "It is not possible to provide universal education, nor is it desirable." The second problem Dawson and Eliot noticed was the trend towards specialization and utility in the educational system. As the state tightened its grip on education, an increasing number of specialties developed, gradually minimizing liberal arts education. As Dawson puts it, the old humanistic education taught all that it knew about the civilization of ancient Greece and Rome and taught little else. In the 19th century, this aristocratic and humanist ideal was gradually replaced by the democratic utilitarianism of compulsory state education, on the one hand, and by the ideal of scientific specialization on the other. Eliot speaks of this trend rather sardonically. He says, "And just as those who should be the intellectuals regard theology as a special study, like numismatics or heraldry, with which they need not concern themselves, and theologians observe the same indifference to literature and art as special studies which do not concern them, So our political classes regard both fields as territories of which they have no reason to be ashamed of remaining in complete ignorance. Kirk criticized the compartmentalization of knowledge, leading at best to the development of elites unable to communicate with one another. Since it is primarily the liberal arts disciplines that perform the task of transmitting culture, the ascendancy of a plethora of specialized fields becomes a problem. They also argue that liberal arts education must fully acknowledge and explore the centrality of Christianity to the Western cultural tradition. The education in Christian culture they proposed was not an indoctrination or an attempt to convert. In Eliot's words, the purpose of a Christian education would not be merely to make men and women pious Christians. A system which aimed too rigidly at this alone would become only obscurantist. A Christian education would primarily train people to be able to think in Christian categories, though it could not compel belief and would not impose the necessity of insincere profession of belief. What is suggested in an academic study involving history, philosophy, literature, and art, but highlighting the Christian tradition in which all Western thought occurred. Dawson makes a fairly detailed proposal for this approach. He concedes that it's not possible to reinstate theology as the queen of the sciences. However, he says, what I do believe very strongly is that the time has come to consider the possibility of introducing the study of Christian culture as an objective historical reality into the curriculum of university studies. This objective approach, treating the subject as an academic one, would presumably make the Christian tradition accessible to those who know little about it, which includes many Christians. Excuse me. Wait a minute. Perfect. What this suggests is that a renewal of the liberal arts needs to take full account of the role of religion in the making of Europe, the title of another book by Dawson. He says, a curriculum in Christian culture would embrace a cooperative study of Christian philosophy, Christian literature, and Christian history. Dawson looked to liberal arts colleges, and especially Catholic ones, to lead the way. Neither Eliot nor Dawson was particularly sanguine about the likelihood of success for their propositions. Near the end of notes towards the definition of culture, Eliot famously laments, in our headlong rush to educate everybody, we are lowering our standards and more abandoning the study of those subjects by which the essentials of our culture, of that part of it which is transmissible by education, are transmitted, destroying our ancient edifices to make ready the ground upon which the barbarian nomads of the future will encamp in their mechanized caravans. It's kind of a Mad Max vision. Dawson seems to echo this dispiriting vision near the end of his book on education. He names some of the horrors visited on their nations by the totalitarian governments of the time and concludes thus, but what is most alarming in these developments is the way in which this reversion to barbarism has been associated with technological advance. Indeed, the new barbarism is itself technological, inasmuch as the whole system of propaganda and persecution, mass trials and concentration camps represents a carefully thought-out technique for ensuring social conformity and remaking mankind after some new ideological pattern. Nor did he think the democracies, which were even more advanced technologically, were immune to the totalitarian tendencies of the age, speaking of the possibility of a democratic totalitarianism, a phrase Eliot echoes. Yet, neither of them gave up hope. And of course, Kirk is famous for giving long, dispiriting talks and then saying, yet cheerfulness will break through. At the end of notes, Eliot offers some gray light. But, he says, we can at least try to save something of those goods of which we are the common trustees, the legacy of Greece, Rome, and Israel, and the legacy of Europe throughout the last 2,000 years. This recalls surely a line from the end of a famous poem of his, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." Dawson expresses some similar hope, warning that spiritual renewal cannot be brought about by purely emotional revivals. But a complete change of spiritual orientation cannot be effective unless it takes place on a deep psychological level. It cannot be had for the asking. It can only be reached by a long and painful journey through the wastelands. So the wasteland barbarian theme keeps going. But Dawson's last words are somewhat more encouraging, and we'll end with those. So long as the Christian tradition of higher education still exists, the victory of secularism, even in a modern technological society, is not complete. There is still a voice to bear witness to the existence of the forgotten world of spirituality in which man has his true being.